Here we are. All right. The abundance of the break has come to an end. We now return to the rigid order and structure of our next session. So, let me give you a puzzle from Genesis 1 to set up this next time. And that is the puzzle of what happens on day 6. Something very unexpected happens. Speaking as a reader, speaking as perhaps a hearer of that liturgical poem. Remember, there's 3 days of ordering, then 3 days of filling with abundance, and every one of the 3 days of filling corresponds to a day of ordering. So on day 6, the land and as well as the sea are now filled with teeming creatures. Let me take this baby away for a moment, since it's very distracting to have a baby behind you as you speak. So, but we're going to get back to the baby. On day 6, every day God has spoken, something happens, it's so, God beholds, and it's good. And so day 6 comes to what seems like the end. That is, God has spoken into being has said, let there be these creatures filling the land as well as the sea. God sees, but suddenly the pattern of the poem is broken. And there is what I like to call a bonus round on day 6. So, in video games, people in this room don't play video games, I can tell. But you reach a certain level and you get like a bonus round, right? And in this bonus round, suddenly God, who has been speaking impersonally in the third person singular imperative, the jussive mood of the verb, let there be, let there be, let there be, God suddenly switches moods of the verb and speaks in the cohortative and says, let us make. And this intervention is unexpected, first of all, because something's already been made on day 6. It seems like the realm of sea and land has been filled, and you would expect it to just end. Day 6 is over, the evening, morning, the 6th day. So just the fact that God has this additional act of creation is a surprise. And then, of course, the fact that God speaks in the plural, as we already mentioned, is a tremendous surprise. What in the world is God doing speaking in the plural? We Christians have our own ways of understanding that now. Who knows exactly what Hebrew readers might have made of it? And then God makes a kind of creature that's very different from any other. Let us make human beings in our image. And in the image of God, God created them. Male and female, God created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And only after the creation of these creatures does God look at the world. And then there's a further complication of the pattern. He speaks, it's so, he beholds, it's good every day. But on this day, God saw everything that he had made, and it was very good. In Hebrew, you get the intensification just with reduplication. So tov in Hebrew is good. Every day has been good. Tov, 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 every day. But at the end of day 6, it's tov, tov. Good squared. Very good. Why? What is it about this final day, and perhaps this final act, this final bonus round, that takes us from good at every stage, even in its most basic divisions of order and structure, the world is good. But now on day 6, at the climax of creation, when all is done, it's good, good. I want to suggest that the reason it's good, good at the end of day 6 is culture, or maybe more specifically, the potential, the possibility now of culture. In fact, let me show you. I'm going to be, I have many slides to share with you, but you cannot bear them all. So I'm going to be switching around a little bit. But let me put this one up now. I think this transition from good to very good is, in fact, the transition from nature to culture. Or at least that it's suggestive of the transition from nature to culture. That it is when you add culture, that is the human act of making something of the world. By the way, I'm not going to go into this at length, but if you want a definition for culture, sometimes people feel comfortable when they have definitions. I would define it, borrowing entirely from the journalist Ken Myers, as what human beings make of the world, in both senses. What human beings make of the world in both senses. And when you have human beings operating culturally on the natural, or maybe it would be better in the biblical frame to say the created world, not inert nature or neutral nature, but the created world that God made, the good created world, when you add culture to it, the good world becomes very good. So here's a couple pictures of how we image bearers do this, each in completely unique ways that no other creature does. So back to the baby. Every presentation is improved by a picture of a baby. So here's your baby for this presentation. This is not a baby I'm related to. This is the #1 Google image result for baby. So here it is. For better or for worse, this is what you got. Anyway, we all were once the age and stage of this little guy, I guess he is. He's wearing blue in the picture that I have here. And at that stage, what could you make of the world? Well, not a whole lot. Your capacity was quite limited. It's actually one of the amazing features of human beings, is how little we can do when we're born. We are the most helpless, arguably, of all creatures in infancy. But there is one set of capacities that every typical human being has control over, even at this very early stage, and can actually volitionally manipulate. And that is the vocal tract. So most basically, babies can cry, and they do that semi-voluntarily, involuntarily, voluntarily. Usually when there's something wrong, the wonderful thing about babies at this stage, if they're kind of normal, healthy kids, is there's really only 3 things that can be wrong. They are hungry, they're tired, or they need to be changed. And so when any of those 3 things is wrong, the baby cries, and the parents, the first great challenge of parenthood is which of the 3 is it at this moment. And then when it's 2 out of 3 or 3 out of 3 that are wrong at once, that's when parenting gets really stressful. But when a baby has had a good meal, has had a nap, and is nice and dry everywhere, the baby does not cry, hardly ever. Instead, babies vocalize, and they just start to experiment with words. With sounds, sorry. And so they'll try making all kinds of sounds. My kids love to make raspberries, brrr. My kids would do that for hours on end, it seems like. And then you'll try, different configurations of tongue and teeth. So you can make you can let your tongue be relaxed and just make a consonant with your lips and just pass air through, and you get a plosive, like a puh, puh, puh. But then you can voice it. That is, you can activate the larynx as the air goes by, and then you get a voiced plosive or bilabial consonant, buh, buh, buh. And babies will just try all these combinations. Then you can make a unvoiced dental consonant where the tongue's right behind the teeth, t sound. But then you could also make a consonant where the larynx is activated, the tongue's right behind the teeth, and you make a sound like this, da, da. And one day, the baby's experimenting with voiced dental consonants and makes this sequence of noises, da, 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 da. And at this moment, a very unexpected thing happens in the baby's life. This incredibly important, huge figure in the baby's world appears over the crib, often lifts the baby out of the crib, parades the baby around the house, and says, he's saying, or she's saying, dada, daddy, which the baby was not doing. This was just voiced dental consonant day, Okay. But the baby has this dawning realization, I think I just made sense. Dada, yes, daddy, dad. Now, when my son did this, actually, dada initially meant doggy rather than daddy. So we got rid of the doggy, and then it meant daddy. That last part is entirely untrue, but it's so funny that I just have to say it, and people laugh. It wasn't our dog. If it had been our dog, it was our housemate's doggy, so we couldn't get rid of it. But if we could have, maybe I would have. Eventually, he figured out Dad has daddy. And what that baby is doing at that moment is entering into the most astonishing human cultural achievement, the most amazing thing any human being will do, in my opinion, in their whole lives, everyone in this room included, is acquire language. And what is language but the ordering of the world, the ordering of this kind of unruly, kind of crazy apparatus we have of resonating cavities in our head, our sinuses, and our lungs, these 2 globes that draw air in, and these little folds over which the air passes, this kind of weird assemblage we have of our bodies. Our bodies are so odd when you start really looking at them. But we structure the world, and we do this in terms of phonemes. So phonemes are structured units of sound that you learn to recognize as part of the acquisition of language. Those get combined into linguistic units, the most basic unit of words. The baby realizes there are these rules. And the most amazing thing is that Chomsky demonstrated, the great linguist Noam Chomsky demonstrated, that every human being must arrive in the world prepared cognitively and in terms of their brain preparation to acquire the rules of syntax through induction. That is, not being taught them. No one sits down with a baby and says, now, my son Timothy, in the English language, when you want to construct a sentence, it's subject, verb, object. And then over in Germany, someone says, oh, mein Liebchen, here in Germany, in Deutschland, it's subject, object, verb. I'm not even sure if that's true of German, but there are many languages in which the object comes before the verb rather than after. No one teaches us any of those things. Our brains come parameterized. This is Chomsky's argument, and I believe it's held up. Our brains come with like little built-in switches, little built-in pieces of potential structure, and just by attending to spoken speech around us, we can intuit, okay, I live in a language world where this structure happens of subject, object, and verb. And we just flip that little switch. We come prepared for this structure of grammar, and yet within that structure, and within a finite set of vocabulary that we acquire, and we acquire enough to be fully linguistically competent in many ways by the time we're 5 years old or so, within a bounded set of words and a completely fixed linguistic structure that we cannot change. I cannot dictate the rules of the English language. I have to follow them. There is unpredictable, teeming, infinite variety possible. So that when I took linguistics in college, one of the things I most vividly remember is one of my professors saying, we have every reason to think that every human being, by the time they reach maturity, has uttered a sentence that has never been uttered before in the history of language. You have said, unless you are a very boring person, you have said something using the fixed rules of grammar and the fixed vocabulary available to you. You have uttered a sentence no other human being ever uttered. That's abundance within order, right? And human beings use this to further order their world. We then acquire the capacity to interact with our world in highly structured ways through the use of language to communicate to other human beings what we're noticing about the world, what we find perplexing about the world, terrifying about the world, beautiful about the world, useful about the world. And with that, we start to be able to act in scales and at levels in the world that no other creature can act. That's language. And everyone in this room managed to do this without even trying. In fact, you enjoyed it the whole way along. Unlike school later on, when you were acquiring language, I think everyone in this room probably this was true, it was almost entirely just pure delight for you as a little 2-year-old, 3-year-old human being. Astonishing. One other thing human beings do is we start to render artistic representations of the world. So we start to take these things that are available to us. This is from Lascaux in France. These pigments that you can find in nature and a suitable wall, although this bison is actually painted on the ceiling of a cave. It's quite extraordinary to realize. This is not a little doodle on the wall of a cave. This is actually, this bison is about an arm span, a human arm span wide, and it's painted on a ceiling that's about 12 feet off the floor of the cave, so roughly like this room that we're in. And this is done at the dawn of human agency and activity in the world. Human beings start doing this. Picasso visited the caves of, I think he went to Mirabeau, maybe not to Lascaux, but he went in and saw these renderings in 2 dimensions of 3-dimensional creatures, and he said, we've learned nothing. They figured it all out at the dawn of humanity. As early as we find tools, we find art. And what is art but bringing a kind of order and structure and then meditating on what is this abundant world we're in? Now, fast forward to the present, and you have people doing things like what my wife does. So this is my wife, Catherine. And I like this picture of Catherine because I'm married to a physicist, and this is my physicist wife, Catherine, in her lab. Now, it's not the greatest picture. It's fuzzy and low res, and the background is not in focus, but it just reminds me of what my wife does every day at work, which is astonishing to me, which is experimental physics. Catherine is a condensed matter physicist, and for her postdoctoral work, which she continued in her lab at Swarthmore College, she has this table. It's called a laser table that's insulated from vibration and so forth. And on it are all these prisms and mirrors, and you bounce a pulsed laser light. Laser is already a highly ordered form of light. You bounce them, the laser, through all these refining pieces of instrumentation. If this sounds vague, it's because I have no idea what my wife does. I really, just in awe, and I stand very quietly in the middle of the room when I'm in her lab and try not to poke anything or get poked in the eye by anything. At the end, in some of the experiments she's done, the laser light impinges on this little sample of gallium arsenide or another semiconductor. And through this process of highly structuring light, which most of the time comes to us in fairly unstructured forms, but through this careful refining of light and applying it in very particular conditions to a particular kind of substance that's been itself very highly ordered, amazing things happen at the nanoscale. Beautiful patterns develop, actually, on the silicon that are dictated ultimately by the principles of quantum mechanics, because you're so small that Newtonian mechanics becomes irrelevant and quantum takes over. And these extraordinary abundant patterns begin to grow on the surface of a semiconductor that turn out to have incredibly useful physical properties that we can harness. And this is what scientists get to do. And the amazing thing is, they also do math. And it all makes mathematical sense. That is, the most pure abstract kinds of ordering of reality human beings can imagine. What if we conceived of, for example, the Hilbert space, which is, I have no idea what it is. It's like what you do when you have all the possible permutations of certain kinds of differential equations with imaginary numbers, and if you talk fast enough, a room of pastors will assume you know that you're talking about something real. But the Hilbert space is this completely pure mathematical way of ordering a certain kind of sets and numbers. And it turns out, it's created by, he eventually became Lord Hilbert, I believe, in the middle of the 20th century, articulated first in the first half of the 20th century. It turns out that pure mathematical imagination that involves imaginary numbers, which are, if you remember from high school math, involve the square root of -1, which has no, the square root of a negative number is not a real thing. It turns out that in order to beautifully, elegantly represent what we know about quantum mechanics, you have to use the Hilbert space to do the differential equations. So this completely imaginary world that a mathematician comes up in the first half of the 20th century turns out to be the only way to adequately formalize and model the nature of reality at the tiniest scale, the quantum scale. This is absolutely astonishing that this should be the case, right? That we human beings can, even just in our imagination, order the world. And it turns out that these human efforts in mathematical imagination that are so elegant and beautiful in their own right map onto the created world and have all kinds of usefulness for us as human beings. One more, let me give you another equation here, and then we're going to do a little exercise to talk about this. I want to give you a Genesis 2 picture of what culture is about. There are two things that are said of the plants and trees in the garden. It's said that they are good for food, that is, they have utility, and they are a delight to the eyes, that is, they're characterized by beauty. And this is another equation that adds up to flourishing. When you have utility and beauty together, when something's both useful and lovely, I think you've got the kind of world that you would call very good. Again, we could do the same 2 by 2. I'm not going to take the time to do it, but we could map out what would be a world in which people are only interested in things that are beautiful. Well, that would be a kind of aestheticized world, a world that doesn't care about usefulness or utility. And then, of course, you could ask, what's a world that's only interested in utility? And that would be a utilitarian world. But the good world that God creates, the garden in which the first human beings are placed, and the world I think that we're meant to cultivate, is a world where things are both useful and beautiful. And the amazing thing about the work my wife does is that it's both incredibly mathematically appealing and elegant and has these profound practical uses in the world we inhabit. It's both useful and beautiful at the same time. Can you imagine then why it might be that when God had created creatures that had the ability themselves to further order the world and to discover more abundance in the world, that God might have said, now it's very good. Because now there are creatures in this world who are actually going to take the world I've made, they're going to investigate it, attend to it, over many generations and across many cultures eventually, shape it in ways that bring out dimensions of order that are not apparent on the surface. So the mathematical structuring of the quantum scale of reality, none of us can just look around and see that. And certainly no pre-human creature can even begin to cognitively approach it. But we human beings are able both to imagine it and to do experiments that then realize the utility of it and bring into being all kinds of technology that actually serves flourishing in the world. That's astonishing. And I think in some sense God knew, if I can put it this way, that one day there would be a Catherine, my wife, who would probe his world and realize it's more good than you could imagine. It's more beautiful than you can imagine. And by the way, it's not a machine. It's not a Newtonian world, a rigid Newtonian world in which it all just follows rules and it's made up of just these little impenetrable atoms and they bounce off each other in completely rule-governed, predictable ways that have no element of unpredictability or variety. Actually, you get down below the macro scale, below the Newtonian scale, to the nanoscale and the quantum scale, and you realize there's unpredictable teeming variety built into the heart of reality such that the only way we can model it is through probability. The Newtonian, it was so easy to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist in 1900. When you did not have, for one thing, the universe that always existed was entirely governed by highly simple, almost algebraic, or at least calculus level, just simple equations that predicted the motion of every atom from the dawn of time to the present into the future. It was a completely mechanistic model of the world, and it works in certain reference frames. In 1900, you can say, well, as Laplace said to Napoleon, when Napoleon asked him, well, where's God in your cosmos? And he said, sire, I've had no need of that hypothesis. That was a possible answer in 1900. Completely impossible in 2015. Now, there's still ways to find your way to an atheist conception of this world, but the idea that the world is a machine is completely gone. It's unpredictable at its roots, and yet it is unpredictable not in a completely chaotic way, but in this gloriously ordered way that we can model with things like Hilbert spaces. Do you see? Does this make sense? Does it at least blow 1% of your mind to think? Like, it's so ordered and abundant at the same time, and only human beings have the capacity to approach that or apprehend that. And when we do well at this, we bring all kinds of possibilities into the world that weren't there before. So I like to use this example. Some of you might have heard me use this before, of the way human beings say order eggs. So eggs are part of nature. They're a good part of nature. But human beings crack open the egg after having obtained it from a free-range chicken who has been known by name and has been cared for in every possible way. Dear chicken, you seem to have an extra egg there. It's not fertilized. Can I borrow it? Clunk, clunk. Yes, thank you. So take a couple of eggs from that chicken, break it open, mix it so that the protein in the white mixes with all that wonderful stuff in the yolk. Put it in just the right conditions in a carefully prepared pan that only a human being would ever think to make. Only a French human being specifically would think to make, with a tiny bit of fat coating the surface. Cook it for the right amount of time, flip it in half once, and you have an omelet. Now, an egg is good. I would say an omelet is very good. All right? This is the pattern of nature and culture. It's good in itself, but wow, that omelet has this kind of fullness and richness that a raw egg, as good as it is in a way, doesn't have. Human beings take brain. They harvest the grain. They take 6 hours of sleep, I was saying. They take grain, they harvest the grain, they blow off the unnutritious chaff, they expose the nutritious germ, grind it, mix it with flour, yeast, and salt, mix it with yeast, water, and salt, let it rise for the right amount of time, put it in the right conditions, and out comes bread. Grain is good. Bread, very good. The world has grapes in it. Human beings structure the grapes. They put them up on trellises. I was in the Central Valley of California last week and just saw both trees and vines, structured, highly structured, but everyone's slightly different. Everyone's structured actually so that it will be exposed to sun and wind, in the case of vine growing, so that it stresses the grapes in various ways, trimmed and pruned in various ways. At the right time, these grapevines produce incredibly sugar-rich grapes, much richer in sugar than normal wild grapes would be. Human beings harvest them, crush them, so the yeast that's been growing on the outside mixes with the sugars on the inside, put them in the right conditions for the right amount of time, ideally in barrels perhaps made of oak, and at the right moment you draw it off, and if you're Baptist, you get grape juice. But if you're Anglican like me, you draw that off and you get wine, which is this astonishing realization of everything that was in that grape. Even the people who really taste wine seriously say you can taste the ground the grape was grown in. The terroir affects the flavor of the wine. And I think even among Baptists, I might be able to say grapes are good, but wine is very good. You don't get wine, you don't get bread, you don't get omelets, you don't get physics without an image bearer. So what are we doing? In a way, we are recapitulating the 6-day story of creation all the time, further ordering the world and discovering more abundance in the world, and not just then jumping and saying, well, good, I want to use that, but actually stopping to enjoy it. Behold, it's very good. Human beings have this built-in, you can't stop them from wondering and delighting and savoring the world at its best. We are not just utility maximizers who just seek something useful and munch it and consume it. We also savor it and we say, behold, this is good. Smell this. Before you even taste it, just smell it. We are doing over and over the 6 days of God's creation. Why has the church not taught this? I have this little theory. I think many of us in this room, I'm assuming many of us in this room, partly because you're here on a weekday, are, rather than being Christian professionals, you're professional Christians. All right? And I'm a professional Christian. It's kind of my job to be a Christian. Lord, have mercy on my soul. Those of us who serve in the church, who serve the institutions that surround the expression of the body of Christ in the world, I think we have a kind of professional interest in the 7th day. This is the day, of course, when God rests from all his labor. It gets transferred in Christian worship to the 1st day of the week, or the 8th day, as folks used to say, because of the resurrection. But we have this vested interest in recalling people to this 7th day that I haven't talked about much, that is the realm of enjoyment, relationship, and indeed rule. When God sits down and when God rests on the 7th day in Genesis, you have to think of this in an ancient Near Eastern context. He does not sit down in a lazy boy, as if, wow, that was a lot of work, and now, let's just see what's on TV. Like, ooh, I need a rest. No. When an ancient Near Eastern God rests, that means that God takes his seat in the throne, physically represented often in the temple, and begins to rule and to behold as the ordered world that he's created now plays itself out. And this is the sense in which the 7th day is the day where the people of God are to reconnect themselves to the God who has finished his work, is very satisfied with it, and now is watching it play out. And this is a radical idea. And we don't have a 7-day work week as biblical people. We have 6 days you shall work, and the 7th you shall rest. But here's the problem. Many of us in this room, what day do we work the hardest? The Sabbath day, the rest day, the return to worship, the recalibration day of Sunday. And it's a very important day. But I think sometimes we have forgotten that the 6-day life is also the calling of the people around us, the people we're serving, And actually, those 6 days of continual human work, week after week, take place within the biblical seventh day. Because there's no ending of the seventh day in Genesis 1. It doesn't say then there was evening, there was morning, and then they were on to something else. Instead, it says God is now resting, fully satisfied with this fully ordered and fully abundant world he's created with his image bearers in it, and he is now beholding what we do in our rhythm of work and rest. But we seventh-day professionals have neglected to celebrate what happens 6 days a week. We have not taught people that what they're doing when they leave our institution is the fulfillment of Genesis 1:26. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. And sometimes this can get really bad. So let me say just this one more thing. Then I want to give you a few minutes for an exercise. I heard it said years ago, and I might even have said it myself, by a worship leader. I spent my 20s, a lot of what I did was musical worship in church and conference settings. And I remember hearing a worship leader say this, and I thought it was so cool that I think I might have said it a couple times. In exhorting a congregation that was being a little lazy in their worship, this worship leader said, you know, the only eternal thing we do together, the only thing we're doing now that we'll be doing in eternity is worship. Like, come on, guys, let's worship. This is what we'll be doing in eternity, right? Have you ever heard something like this? It's a very flattering thought if you're a worship leader. Because the implication is, I don't know what you guys do, like with your days and your talents and your abilities, but I hear on stage, like, I'm doing what we're going to be doing for all of eternity. And I'm so gracious as to invite you to do it with me. What is implicit in that statement is the rest of your week has no eternal significance, is not rooted in creation, doesn't have any place in Revelation and eschatology. But wow, what we do in church really matters. I am sorry to say I've heard that in one form or another in many, many Christian settings I've been in, and I've perpetrated it in my life. Oh, you Harvard students, I know you feel like you need to study for your exam, but there's Bible study tonight. Like, which would God rather have you do? False dichotomy. And maybe there are some nights when actually you should go study. And maybe my little religious thing is not God's biggest agenda for your life. That's a threatening thought. Here's what's really funny about what that worship leader said. Revelation 21 says that the kings of the earth will bring into Jerusalem the glory and honor of the nations. And in my book, Culture Making, I talk about how I think that must refer to all this stuff. Human beings take the natural world, they culture it, and they create things that we might say are very good. Very good food, very good music, very good architecture, maybe even very good laptop computers, I don't know. There is one kind of human cultural artifact that is explicitly said not to be present in the recreated earth. Revelation 21, which describes the kings of the earth bringing in all the fruits of human culture into the New Jerusalem, the furniture of heaven, is going to be the best of human culture, I think. But it specifically says there's one thing that is not in that city. Do you know what it is? A temple. This is a human cultural institution. It's the way we order and structure our space and life for worship, right? Structure space and time to worship. But it's not necessary in the recreated world because in the new world, the whole of the cosmos is a temple. It's all been cultivated in such a way that it all gives glory to God. It's filled with the presence of God. In that day, there will be no need for someone to say to his neighbor, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least to the greatest. No one will teach his neighbor, say, here's how you worship. They'll all worship me because my law will be written on their hearts. The new world does not need a temple. So do you know the only human being who's out of a job in the New Jerusalem? It's the exact opposite of what's implied by, well, worship is our only eternal activity. Yes, of course, our work will be worship. We will spend all of eternity saying, behold, it is very good. The earth will be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord like the waters cover the sea. So significant, it says, not just the glory of the Lord. See, the ultimate story, I'm compressing like 3 days worth of talks into 3 minutes here. The ultimate story is not just good to very good. It's very good to glory. Glory is the fulfillment, every possibility of the world unfolded to its fullness to the praise of its maker. The earth will not just be filled with the glory of the Lord, it will be full of the knowledge of the glory of the Lord. And what does it take to have the knowledge of the glory of the Lord? It takes image bearers who are able to apprehend and reflect back. This is who you are, God. This is how good you are. And how will we do that? Through the fulfillment of our call to cultivate the whole cosmos we were given. And the one person you won't need is someone saying, hey, worship God. Know the Lord. No, that'll be taken care of. So, here's what I'd like us to do for the next 15 minutes or so. I'd like to propose that we Seventh-day people, sorry, I'm just trying to find my slide here, have ended up with language, or you could say languages, and practices that tend to devalue, marginalize, or minimize the value of six-day work. We're so focused on getting people to understand the importance of the seventh day. It is important. It's vital. But we've unconsciously ended up, accidentally even, devaluing, marginalizing, or minimizing six-day work. And so, a couple examples. When we celebrate the fact that someone's gone into full-time Christian work, which is the phrase that some traditions use. And then you ask, well, is there another kind of Christian work? And the implication is there's a category of professions that are really Christian, and then other things are just, well, I don't know what you're doing with your life, but I'm in full-time Christian work. It's interesting what we celebrate in our churches. I was told by a pastor once, he was the pastor at Park Street Church in Boston, a large evangelical church in Boston. He said, we have a woman in our congregation who has faithfully taught second grade Sunday school for over a decade. And every year we call her up along with the other Sunday school volunteers and we celebrate her volunteer service. And we should, because she's a highly accomplished lawyer and it's amazing how she gives herself to these small little children with runny noses and so forth. He said, but the thing about this woman is this was back in the 1990s, she was the lead litigator for the Environmental Protection Agency on the cleanup of Boston Harbor. If you remember, those of you who are my age or so, remember Boston Harbor was one of the most environmentally disastrous sites in the world, in our country, I should say. And the EPA led this huge legal process to lead to it being cleaned up. People now swim in Boston Harbor, which is, I still can't quite imagine, but they do. And she led the process that led to this reclaiming of the goodness of Boston Harbor. He said, we have never celebrated that. Now, absolutely, should we celebrate her volunteering? Absolutely. But why have we never called her up and prayed for her as someone who's a steward of God's creation? We never thought to do that. So who do we celebrate? Well, here's what I'd like you to do. I think this time, in your whole table, I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to do this. So not enough time, not as much as you'll want. But think out loud, and if you want, you can use this butcher paper that's on your table to take notes. What languages and practices in our congregation tend to devalue, marginalize, or minimize six-day work? And I'd like you to think creatively, what could we introduce or create to celebrate six-day work in the context of the seventh day? What could we do actually on the Lord's Day that would celebrate, recenter, validate, value, and frame theologically what people do 6 days a week? What words could we use and what practices, or if you're in some traditions, you'd say liturgies, could we use? Does that make sense as an assignment? So think out loud about that at your tables, take some notes, and then we'll share them with each other over the next hour or so. So go ahead.